Hi there everybody, welcome back to Principles in Curriculum Design. My name's Alex Ford and I'm a Schools History Project Fellow and PGCE tutor at Leeds Trinity University. And over the last few sessions I've been talking to you about this idea of how we generate curriculum and how we build curriculum and build curriculum around principles. So in this session today, we are looking at putting the Schools History Project principles, in my case, into practice, and how does it look when you start using principles to make decisions about your curriculum, and how does that tally up with some of the things about disciplinary curriculum as well. Now for me, I'm just revisiting the SHP principles here because I think it's helpful, and this time I've taken them from, it's kind of an abbreviated version from the website. I think for me, having a look at these principles is helpful because it shows that actually in the Schools History Project principles, there is already a weaving together of disciplinary ideas and bigger principles about the aims of education, the purposes of education. So there are 6 formal principles of the Schools History Project. And I just want to pull out things that I think are really vital here because they will go into how I've then thought about different areas in the curriculum over the years and replanning different elements of the curriculum. So, and actually I want to do it this way because I think sometimes we talk an awful lot about planning curricula from scratch as if you're going to go in and just put in a whole new curriculum. And I have done that on occasions, and it's been brutal, to be frank, and sometimes actually evolution and curricula, revisiting your curriculum and carefully tending and weeding and updating it is usually far better than going with a big landscaping job and ripping it all out, because often what will happen then is you don't get the job finished before the next curriculum change comes. So this is a bit more of a sensitive way of doing it. Anyway, Schools History Project principles. First of all, I love this idea, and whatever I'm doing today, it's kind of driven by this anyway, that history should connect to the lives of young people. It should encourage them to, I love this word, it should encourage them to be curious, develop opinions and values, but not just any opinions and values based on a respect for evidence. And I talked about Mark Bloch a lot last time, who believed that the critical method, the engagement with evidence, was so vital. And that deeper understanding of the present, therefore, comes from a close engagement, a questioning and querying about the past, that curiosity. Secondly, that we need to engage students in the process of historical inquiry. So this is the very disciplinary element of this one. History should involve building knowledge, absolutely. We talked about the power of knowledge, pursuing historical inquiries, engaging with evidence and interpretations. So not just taking things as read, but actually going back and looking at things. And not everybody will agree with that, but I do. And communicating in rigorous and creative ways, and I love both of those being in there. So this idea that all the discipline, those inquiries are going to encompass ideas about change and continuity. They're going to encompass ideas about cause and consequence. So all of that is kind of embedded into that second principle. Thirdly, students should be, or children should be enabled, in fact, it's important it talks about children and young people all the time here, because it's not just about being students. Children should be enabled to develop a deeper knowledge of the past, a strong sense of period, and construct robust chronological frameworks. So that's principle 3. Principle number 4, they should have an opportunity to study a range of periods, so not just modern history, and equally not just ancient history or early modern history, civilizations and cultures beyond Europe. And this is so vital. If you just took the DFE's National Curriculum document as read, you wouldn't necessarily do a lot of that. Local and family history. I think this is a really nice idea that's often overlooked as well. Social and cultural history, so not just political history. And I think that's vital as well. So we're thinking about those balances, and it should involve diverse content, diverse approaches to the study, and a focus on the diverse experience of peoples in the past. And I love that idea that we are all the time, like the giants in the fairy tale, like Bloch says, looking at the experiences of real people, but not just some people. And the bigger version of this says it needs to reflect the diversity of our modern Britain and not just dead white men, which is where we have been, I think. Fifthly, children should have the opportunity to study history around us, that idea of connecting with the historic environment. And some GCSEs do that well now, some less so, but right the way through, that children should see history in the environments that they live in. And that doesn't just mean going to castles, that means looking at the way in which history develops around us. And Rich Kennett, who's also a Schools History Project Fellow, does an amazing project with his students on the history of Bristol and the environment in Bristol around them. Go on his YouTube channel, he's got this lovely paper cutout thing where he looks at the development of Bristol from the earliest times right up until the present. And I think what lucky students that that they get that input and help to understand the environment, the built environment they live in. And not just understanding, the developments, because, I can take anybody to Fountains Abbeys and I can talk about window styles and gritstone till the cows come home, but it's about telling us not just about the buildings, but the lives and beliefs of people in the past. And then finally, and crucially, and almost I feel this one should be first, learning history should be enjoyable and life enhancing for all children, providing foundations for lifelong thinking. So it's not just about the now, and engagement with history. So these are people who go away and they still enjoy history when they've left school. And that idea that we are combining enjoyment and rigour. And it's not one or the other. We humbly suggest you might do both. Okay, so where does that all leave us? Well, I want to look at a few units in terms of teaching that I've had a rethink of over the years, and why I've done that and how the principles have helped me rethink those units and guide me in what I've done. And the first one I want to look at is medieval life. Now, actually, lots of my degree was looking at the Middle Ages, and so I spent a lot of time looking at the kind of history of ordinary people, particularly in the 14th, 15th centuries, sometimes into the 16th, and thinking about things like the Reformation, but also beliefs about life and death, concepts of time, those kinds of things. So medieval life was always something I felt was never done well enough in the curriculum conceptions, either that I inherited or that actually I developed because that was what was in the textbooks, or that just happened to be what we had in stock. So rethinking medieval life was a big one for me, because quite often when you work in schools, medieval life can end up being William comes in, he puts in a feudal system. That's problematic in its own right, but let's leave that for a minute. And then there's this whole chunk of time from sort of 1066 through to the Reformation, if you're lucky, or sometimes we push that even later again, where basically society is a king, a load of powerful barons, and peasants who predominantly have mucky, miserable lives and walk around feeling quite sad about things all the time with not much money, until occasionally they revolt about this or that, or they die in a massive plague. And that to me is what medieval life ends up being. And quite often those medieval life units were some of the worst I used to teach. I can remember doing them as a trainee teacher and having 4 whole lessons just called medieval life, where you kind of just picked some stuff and you went, okay, well, let's do village life today. Let's look at what people wore. Let's do town life today. And there are much better ways of doing that, but so many things just condense the whole of medieval life into this awful block of tedious time that students don't get and teachers don't like teaching. So what should the takeaways be from medieval life? Well, actually, again, if we go and look at lots of the material that's out there, it's not always that helpful. This one is taken from a Key Stage 3 history textbook, and it's a kind of knowledge-rich textbook, and it tries to outline what students should know, or rather, I'm judging by the questions it asks, and these are the summary, the end of chapter questions on the medieval village in this case. I'm trying to judge what it thinks is important for students to know. So what does it want students to know? The proportion of people that worked in land as peasants during the medieval period, the average age of death for a medieval peasant, the house that stood in the middle of a medieval lord's lands. There's a whole range of things on here. I am not convinced that these are the 10 most powerful things for students to know about life in a medieval village. And straight away there are problems with this, because life in a medieval village, when? Are we talking before or after the Black Death? Are we talking in the 12th century? Because that's very, very different to the 14th century, for example. When are we talking? Why are these things important? What are they going to be able to do with this information? So, although, yes, I might teach the proportion of peasants that worked the land during the medieval period, it's high. The vast majority. What need is there to know that percentage beyond that tiny little bit of factual information? There's bigger things we could know. What stew made out of vegetables is number 8. What stew made out of vegetables and grains was eaten by peasants as their main meal? Presumably pottage. Okay, I know that. What am I going to do with that information? I could bring it out later at a pub quiz. I might suggest to my teacher in food tech that we make some pottage. I might feed my family some pottage. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure it is terribly powerful knowledge to send children away with, and it certainly doesn't tell us, and it doesn't reveal an awful lot about the lives and experiences of people in the Middle Ages, if we're being broad and just saying, okay, 500 years between sort of 1066 and the Reformation of people's lives that we're condensing into these 10 slightly banal questions. So how do we rethink it? Well, I think we need to do several things, and this is where I go back to my principles. I was unhappy with the way I taught medieval life, and I was unhappy with the way a lot of textbooks dealt with medieval life, because I went back to my principles and said, these aren't doing these things. What do I want? Well, principle number 2 says I want to be developing rigorous history that's rooted in the discipline and help students engage with the things that people are actually talking about in terms of history. And principle number 4, I wanted them to have experience of a diverse range of people in the past, and whatever you do, if you're talking about medieval peasants as one group of people over 500 years, you've steamrolled all of these different experiences into a pancake of meaninglessness. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but I really do honestly feel that. So how can we do this better? There are ways to do it better, and it is hard. We know that it's hard to find out about the lives of medieval peasants. It's really difficult. That's an interesting question you can ask, by the way. But we can make a better effort at showing the diverse experiences of people who lived in the Middle Ages. And we can do that to start with by focusing the Middle Ages down a little bit more and think about when in the Middle Ages are we talking about. Okay, so one of the really interesting publications that came out in the last couple of years has been this, Exploring and Teaching Medieval History. It was edited by Ian Dawson. It's a wonderful publication in which Ian pulls together short pieces by historians and history teachers talking about what should we know about the Middle Ages. And there are some lovely pieces in there, and they look at the kind of things they think students should have as takeaways. So let's forget that textbook set 10 questions we just saw. This is what historians working at the forefront of their field think children should know about the Middle Ages. Number 1, there was no such thing as medieval life. We've touched on that already. We can't just condense it all into one massive chunk and say this is all medieval life and it's just all the same. That people lived extremely diverse lives. I like the fact that comes up because that connects directly with that one over here. That families often operated as units. We often look at medieval peasants, we often look at men, but actually the point lots of these historians make, people like John Gillingham, for example, is that, and Jeremy Goldberg, is that women were massively important, of course, in medieval life, and children were massively important in medieval life, and women and children and adults, women and children and men, adults and children, parents and grandparents operated in units, in family units, and those family units were vital in understanding the Middle Ages. So as soon as we try and separate them out, we run into problems. That actually, and this is a really interesting one, the key divisions were not, as I taught for years and years and years, despite having a lot of medieval background of my own, the key divisions were not between freemen and villeins. We focus on that, we obsess over that because of our presentist perspective on this idea that being free is important. And yes, absolutely, the idea of freedom was important then, but the fundamental division, certainly according to Goldberg, is that the division was between husbandmen and labourers. And that is to say, husbandmen, people who owned enough land that they could survive on the proceeds of it. And you could be free and do that, and you could be a villein and do that. There were very land-rich villeins, and although the land wasn't theirs, the produce that came off it was theirs, even though they had to give some of that away to a landlord. And therefore, they did much better. These villeins with fairly hefty chunks of land did far better than lots of freemen who, certainly by the 14th and 15th centuries, were being handed down smaller and smaller parcels of inherited peasant land, and therefore struggling. So husbandmen owned land, labourers had to work for others. So the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, in certainly the 14th century, would have, an early 14th century, would have been in a category of being between these two. The best off would have been husbandmen, the worst off would have been labourers. But actually the key division in society at that time was your land status, whether you were a husbandman or not whether you were free or not. That was a secondary concern for most people. Okay. that there was a logic and a method to the ways of life, and that people did things for reasons. And I think there's a very great danger sometimes when we look at the Middle Ages and look at life in the Middle Ages, we look at the funny way that people lived back then, or wasn't it odd what they believed? And actually there is a rational way of thinking through that. We have to get into the mentalities, according to these historians, and I think as well, we have to get into the mentalities of the way people thought in the Middle Ages. And that means understanding how religion impacted on lives. It means understanding how agriculture shaped lives, how the seasons shaped lives, and understanding that the ways people reacted to those things were logical in the context they lived in. And crucially, and this for me is a really big one for connecting children to the past, and going back to principle 1, which I haven't put on here, that people in the past, in the Middle Ages, strove to improve their lives. They strove communally, they strove individually to have better lives, to do what the best for their children. They did what they could to ensure they had a nice quality of life where they could, and where those things were impinged on, they got angry and they did things about it. And my goodness, that's got parallels with the human experience right the way through time. And I love the fact, I've covered it up now with this, but I love the fact on Ian's cover image here, we've got these two people holding hands, because it reminds us that people in the Middle Ages are only removed from us really by a big chunk of time. But actually they still feel some of the same things that we do. And yes, maybe not in the same ways. And yes, maybe there are differences, but there is a continuity in the way that people tell jokes. There's a continuity in the way that people fall in love. There's a continuity in the way that some people wanted to be free and go off and get married against the wishes of their parents, who said, you know what, you'd be far better staying here with us. And all those things come up if you start looking at the Middle Ages in any kind of depth. So I wanted to rethink medieval life. I wanted to build it around these. I wanted to do it for these reasons. These principles were guiding that. And I wanted to be able to draw on the discipline, and principle 2 says draw on the discipline. I wanted to be able to draw on the discipline in order to improve students' understanding of medieval life and improve those medieval life units. And this is one of the things that I began to do. I wanted to ground medieval peasants a little bit more. I didn't want them just to be this kind of cross-time block of the same sorts of people. So this could go with a number of inquiries. The inquiry I went for in the end was what really mattered to peasants in the early 14th century. But it could go with inquiries like, who were peasants in the 14th century England, or what was everyday life in the 14th century, was everyday life in the 14th century just about surviving? So we could kind of directly challenge a misconception about that. And lots of these therefore are focusing on issues of similarity and difference. And I wanted to ground these peasants in time, and I wanted to ground them in time before the Black Death, but after a lot of the major changes that had happened post-Norman conquest. And basically that means looking in the mid to late 1200s and early 1300s to kind of get a sense of what we might typically think of as medieval. And I wanted to do this in a fun and engaging way and set some context. So as part of this inquiry, a beginning to this was to get students to engage with a medieval board game. And you might have seen things like this before. What I've tried to do here is build it on a little bit further. So what students do is they are given a character. I'll just show you a character now. So one of the characters here, they work in teams, so they have a group of 4 of them working together. And this is character card number 1. It's a husbandman, and it's a Valine husbandman. So we are focusing on that idea of the land status being important here. I've got them as a unit, so it's John and Joan, and they are Valines, and they live on this fictional manor. And yes, of course they are fictional, because I don't have great sources of information about medieval peasants, certainly not medieval Valines, although there is slightly more about Valines in some cases, because their records are kept in manors. They have 2 teenage daughters and a son, so we've got this idea of a family unit, and we get a sense of how they are surviving and how they are trying to thrive as well. So there is some sense here where when I introduce this with students, we have to spend a bit of time looking through the character information. We have to look at some of the key terms. We usually do a little bit of background to this as well, and we've already come from having done some things on the Norman Conquest, so we understand a little bit about the context beforehand. We're not just jumping straight into the 13th century, and we've done probably a little bit on the land distributions, probably some bits on political changes that have happened in the 1200s as well. Okay, so the whole game is based around a year on the manor as these characters. And so they start, so with John and Joan's case, they've got 30 acres of land and therefore begin here on the game board. And what they do is roll a dice, and whatever number they get, so 1 or 2 they go up, 3 or 5 they go across, 6 they go down, and they go across and they read what happens to them on a card. And you'll be able to download this whole game in the links below this video. And the basic idea is if you get 1 or 2 and go up, your life is improving. If you get 3 to 5 and you go across, your life is pretty much staying on par with where it is. And if you get 6 and go down, it's getting worse. So you kind of get a sense visually of where your life is going. Wouldn't that be nice for all of us? Or maybe depressing, I don't know. So they move across the game board, and they have to read out what's happened to them, and they share it with the others on their table. And of course, because they've all got different characters, they start to get a picture. So there is a Verline husbandman, there is a free husbandman, there is a Verline labourer, and there is a single free peasant, cottager, who's kind of living on his own. And therefore they start to get a sense of what kinds of things impact their lives. So if I show you this now, so we started here with our first lot. Let's say they throw a 3 and kind of continue across onto A2. So the ploughing is completed quickly. John's able to get some help from some villagers. He pays them a small amount and feeds them too, so he gets some food. And this is just the food element, is the idea of you need to get enough food to help your family survive at the end of the year. And basically they continue going across the board and looking at what happens. As they do that, so if we go across a bit further, so you see as they go lower down, worse and worse things start to happen to them. There are key points in the year where they're going to be able to do harvesting. There are key points in the year that make the difference between success and failure. And if they get to the end of the year and they don't have enough food, they have some big decisions to make. As a village, they need to discuss what will they do. Some of the people usually survive, some of the people don't. What will the village do together? And we look at that idea of communal responsibility in villages. We get the sense of people who had opportunities. So if you got to the end of the year and you had surplus food, you can sell it and exchange it for more land, and then you can play a second year through. So you might buy some more land. You might equally have to sell land during the game, and that then next time you start the year reduces your chance of survival. So the whole game plays through to give them a sense of 4 different types of people living on a manor in the 14th century. It gets at the heart of the diversity of the experiences of people in the past. And yes, they are only archetypes, but they're still based in historical research. It shows that people both survived and tried to thrive, but also the impact of land on that. And the more land you started with, the more likely you were to end up going on a good trajectory. And the less land you had, the more likely you were to end up on a poor trajectory through your year. It focuses on the importance of family in all those things, for good and ill. So families being occasionally people who help you out, people, wives in particular might have been selling flowers, selling goods to market, brewing beer and selling that. So the importance of women in the household economy, but equally the dangers of family when people fall ill and you've got responsibility. So both sides of that. And of course the crucial role of luck, and sometimes it is on a roll of a dice. And although you can start up here, and it's rare that somebody, and I got, my brother's an engineer, I think I've mentioned this before, and he ran some simulations to work out how often different events would happen, which took a very long time. So there is a chance you could start at the top there and end up right down at the bottom, but it's an incredibly rare chance. So that idea that over a class you get a sense of how a village might have progressed. What do we do with this, therefore? Well, this starts out the topic for students. It uses a game to engage them, but it has a very serious purpose because it develops a sense of period. It helps them develop a sense of people and how people behaved in the past and the logical decisions people made. And it develops in them a sense of the things that mattered. So what does this set students up for? Well, hopefully it gives them a grounding of knowledge that helps them understand the Middle Ages in more detail by understanding a small element of the Middle Ages, a medieval village in the 14th century, in more detail. It helps underpin that understanding of diversity in the past so that we don't just run across diversity once we leave the Middle Ages and enter periods which are better documented, that they understand there is diversity then. That was the fourth principle. We can say it's working on principle 2 because it's based in, you know, the work historians are doing around the Middle Ages at the moment. It's hitting principle 6 for me because it's rigorous, but hopefully it's also enjoyable and accessible. Do you know what? Everybody can do this game. Yes, they might need a little bit of support doing some of the thinking through activities, but if you do it carefully, children can make some really insightful comments about the way medieval villages worked, and villages, of course, in the 14th century worked. And for me, this is helping children understand the world they live in as well, because although we are talking about life in the 14th century and life that seems very remote, what they're finding is connections with people in the past. And that connecting with people, that understanding of others, for me is one of the vital roles of history. If we can understand diverse peoples in the past and we can understand the things that motivated people who are very remote from us in time, hopefully it also helps us engage with and understand people who feel very remote from us in the present day. And I think that's a very powerful aspect of history, which we're getting through here as well. So there is a whole range of principles for me that this kind of activity supports, especially when, of course, it's done not just as a standalone game, but in a bigger inquiry about what mattered to peasants in the 14th century or some of those other questions we looked at. So I'm going to keep with the medieval theme just for a minute because the Middle Ages, as I've said, is one of the areas I've often felt in my own curricular planning has been weaker. And often because it's done in year 7 and there's this sense that maybe it's too complicated for year 7s to understand certain things. But actually, sometimes the things that we fail to plant in our understanding of the Middle Ages actually stand in the way of people's later understanding as well. So sometimes we need to think about the key ideas we plant in year 7 so that later they can, in that garden analogy, flourish when they study things later on. So for example, one of the things that really struck me when I was reading John Gillingham was this idea that the entrepreneurial developments, and I'm using that kind of in inverted commas, but the entrepreneurial developments that are happening in the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries amongst the peasant classes especially, really help explain the development of a money-based economy. And that, in turn, helps explain why in the 17th, 18th centuries, we get the emergence of an industrial Britain, which is based and rooted in the kinds of early proto-industries that have been developing in the Middle Ages. How many of us really teach that? How many of us teach about medieval extraction industries, for example? Now, I think that on the surface can sound quite dull, but actually it's really fascinating, and it helps us understand the history of the later world that we will encounter. And so when I started to think about the Middle Ages, a couple of principles came up again. Principle 2, I thought, actually, I'm not building really empowering knowledge about the Middle Ages in terms of the economy. The economy doesn't appear really until I teach about, say, Elizabethan England, and I start talking about early empire, and I talk about a little bit later on post-Elizabethan England, the East India Company and places like that, things like that. Also, it's not really therefore developing a rigorous, robust chronological framework. Principle 3, this idea that there is an economy theme which goes right the way through history, and actually helping students to grasp that will help them understand some of the later developments that they come across. So one of the things I wanted to do therefore was get really into this idea of how money was functioning in the Middle Ages, and in particular I wanted to root that again in a very particular period in the Middle Ages. So in this case I wanted to look in the reign of Edward I, and I think this is a really good starting point because Edward I does an awful lot of changes in parliamentary terms to do with money, and largely because he was spending huge sums of money on castles and wars, which of course he's very, very famous for in the 1270s through the early 1300s. And I've based this on a number of things. I've already talked about John Gillingham, also Christopher Dye's Making a Living in the Middle Ages, Jeremy Goldberg's A Social History of Medieval England. And what they really look at is the fact there are really strong links between town and country economies. They show that there's a focus on the money economy, and that is growing in this period, so the late 1200s especially, and that actually the kings and the people that we tend to look at when we look at the Middle Ages, the kings and the barons and the church classes, were really heavily dependent on this kind of peasant entrepreneurialism. So how does this all fit together? Well, we've got that inquiry, who was paying for Edward I's wars. We do a little bit of looking at Edward I's campaigns. We have a think about the medieval economy, and we're going to have a look at that section. And then we think about how Edward used and changed Parliament to impact upon that as well. So this is how that looks. So it starts with a kind of diagram looking at, well, who was there in the Middle Ages? And Edward I up at top left here, obviously paying for his wars, but also these groups of people in the town and in the countryside, and getting students to use information to track the flows of money in late 1200s England. Now, you can download this if you want. It's in the links below, and you can have a go at it. I'm going to do a very skipped, quick version of it just to show you how it works. So we might start, for instance, with the town lords. Many towns were built on lands held by powerful barons or even churches or abbeys. So this idea of the importance of towns in the economy, had 500 towns by 1300, and rich lords had to pay large taxes to the king if he asked. So we've got our first set of money going from these town landholders to the king, and this is part of the answer of who's paying for Edward I's wars. Lords made money by selling plots in their towns to wealthy merchants and other nobles. So there's some more merchants, there's some more nobles, country landholders, and they're paying smaller amounts of money. You see the arrow sizes here, to these town landowners, and of course that's going over in tax. These people were known as burgesses and got a say in how the town was run. Others, like artisans and traders, had to pay rent and pay market taxes to those town lords. So again, we've got a new flow of money coming through here. Many town nobles would buy luxury goods like wine from merchants directly, and the very richest built huge castles. So we could now have arrows going back the other way. So town landholders buying from merchants in this direction, and also maybe buying from artisans who are down here. And so we start to get a sense of how these flows of money are happening. Okay, let's move that on a little bit further. So what we start to get then is a sense of how money is coming from major landholders and going to the king, and predominantly from the town and going to the king. But as we develop that a bit further, and I'm skipping out a big load of input here, we're going to go straight through to Valines now, which would come later in this thing. So as we go through each stage of this, we say, okay, who's paying for the wars? Well, it appears to be town landholders, it appears to be the rich, the wealthy, it appears to be people in towns predominantly. And then as we expand that out, we start to see the picture gets more and more complex. So the next bit we add in is the Valines. So this is just a bit of information about Valines on here. So Valines were not free, they had to work for a lord for a set number of days each year. They grew crops and helped improve land, so it could be rented out for more money. Valines would charge fees by their lords, so we've got a set of monetary payments here, and of course there's lots of Valines, so we could do several arrows going into these country landholders. They also had to give up a large portion of their crops each harvest time to the lords. This was a kind of payment. So lots of money going from Valines to country landholders. Valines bought and sold crops with traders. So the money is buying things from traders, but also traders are buying things from Valines, and we start to get a sense of the money flows there. And with other villages as well, so which doesn't come up on here. Only the very wealthiest Valines paid tax to the king. So the Valines, of course, aren't paying directly to the king. They're not directly paying for Edward's wars. But this money here, just zigzag on that for a minute, this money here is coming from the money, the crops these Valines are growing and the rents and monies they're paying. It's also coming from the money the traders are making, and therefore it's influencing this one. So what we start to see as they develop through this is the fact that there is a really diverse economy. We start to see the kinds of things individual groups in medieval society, in 13th century society, are doing to improve their lot and make money. So it actually tallies really nicely with the medieval peasant game that we saw before. And we get a sense of how and who is paying for Edward's wars, and therefore we start answering that question, and we therefore have a better understanding of the way economies function. And it has a lovely connection with lives today, because of course we can say, yeah, okay, who makes who are the big payers of tax? Actually, not tax, because that's not very helpful, because Amazon don't pay any tax. But who makes the big money today? And it's companies like Amazon. Where does that money come from? Well, quite often it comes from an international version of this, where there's a connection between our country and Western countries and exploiting labour elsewhere. So there is a very real connection with the bigger world as well they can get. And they can also then connect this up to, I think, the Industrial Revolution. So another thing that you might like to have a look at as a way of putting principles back into your units. Secures lots of concepts as well. So the nature of freedom in the Middle Ages, who was making England rich, how town and countryside were connected, factors connecting wealth in the Middle Ages, complexity of medieval society, privileges of the gentry and especially of monks. And if you have a look at the monks card, you'll see that they get a really free ride, and that can really underpin work on the Reformation and understand why people were, or certainly why the king was quite angry with monks in the Reformation. As my 3-year-old in this house says, bad King Henry told the monks to go away. That kind of has got embedded here. And then there's obviously the smaller ideas that come through this kind of activity. So differences between freemen, villeins, husbandmen and labourers, which underpins some of that work that they will look at in a medieval village in the 13th century. 14th century, sorry. What merchants, artisans and traders do. What are those roles? What do these people do in a way that's not just about define an artisan, define a merchant, define a trader. They get to see that happening in these kinds of trade negotiations. The idea of luxuries in the Middle Ages, I think, is a really important one to get through. So again, students can connect with the past and what kinds of things people were trading, the importance of wool, but also spices and things coming from overseas. So there's all sorts of sense of period stuff as well that are being developed through this kind of activity. Another area where I went back to was the Norman Conquest. And I've kind of ranted about the Norman Conquest in previous episodes of this, but I've said already, how much time did the historians really devote to the battle itself? Not an awful lot. It is a significant battle. It is brutal. It is bloody. Huge numbers of Anglo-Saxon nobility die in the Norman Conquest, and particularly at Hastings. But the debates are around the significance of the conquest to our constitution, the significance of conquest for ordinary people, the nature of the settlement, the kind of time and the change that occurs over time. That's really what historians are talking about. And so for this one, I ended up going back and saying, well, again, that principle too, I want to be up to date with the recent debates that are happening. We started from this point of view saying, well, let's have a look at why historians argue the Norman Conquest is so significant. So what I started doing with Year 7 is saying, well, let's cover the battle and let's cover the invasion and let's talk about the actual Battle of Hastings and get that out of the way in the first lesson, and then let's think about the conquest as a process of conquest and look at the changes the Normans brought, and we'll do that through this lens of why do historians argue that the Norman conquest is so significant, using people like Robert Bartlett here. What does he argue is significant about the Norman conquest, and then seeking evidence to kind of back up these claims and say, okay, so why is he arguing this, and having a look then at the ways in which in this case the language shifts. I'm just going to underline a few bits for you here. Look at ways in which the language shifts. So we get this French-speaking language, the language of power. Having a look at this kind of cross-channel empire and the intertwining of French and English politics. Having a look at the advent of French lords in bishops and abbots, barons, and that kind of transplanting. So things you'd normally do maybe under the feudal system, look at how that has happened. So starting with that, and then having a look at other interpretations of the significance of the Norman Conquest. So there are some cards, if you want, down there that give students more evidence for the impact of the Norman Conquest and let them make some judgments about why that might be significant. Or alternatively, come up and using somebody like Mark Morris, who makes actually a very different set of claims about why the Norman Conquest is significant. So many things continued before. In other areas of dramatic change. Not only did Normans bring the new forms of architecture and fortification, Bartlett doesn't talk about that. This is Morris, incidentally, just talking in the introduction of his book on the Norman Conquest. Bartlett, I emailed and said, why do you think the Norman Conquest is so significant? And he very kindly emailed back. Well, Mark didn't, but we won't hold that against him. A new ruling elite wasn't. So now you can get them to compare what the two think are significant. Both of them think are very significant. The new language of power, they both said, was significant. A new set of attitudes and morals. So if we look at differences, I'm just going to do these in blue. Morris argues for new forms of architecture and attitudes and morals being crucial, the most significant aspects, whereas Bartlett doesn't, and which impacts on warfare, politics, religion, law, freedom of peasants. That's quite interesting if you're doing other later stuff on peasants. They altered what it meant to be English. And if you've read Morris, you'll know he's got this lovely analogy about the tree being cut down and regrowing from Anglo-Saxon roots. So again, what you can do is say, well, here's the evidence that supports Morris's version of the significance of the Norman Conquest. And then we've got an interesting debate starting to happen about why historians come up with these different views of the significance of the Norman Conquest. Okay, and so all that work on Hastings and rethinking how I was going to approach the Battle of Hastings actually led me to think much more about the problems in setting up my Hastings unit. So once I reworked that, the next big problem I came across was the fact that lots of my students saw the Norman Conquest as this kind of weird thing that sat alone in time, and they didn't really see it as part of a bigger process of expansion and settlement, particularly by the Normans, but also by other groups in this period. They didn't really understand the world in the 11th century. So what was happening in the 11th century? So and the context in which the Norman conquest of England fitted. So what I wanted to do again was build out their understanding of the world in the 11th century, rooting it in the discipline again, and exposing students to a more diverse history, so that the first thing they cover when they look at history in year 7 is not just something that's focused on England alone. And that's what tends to happen if you begin with the Battle of Hastings. You get this very English version of history, even though obviously it impacts on other parts in Britain. We really focus on the English elements of it. So how do we do that? Well, I wanted to have a zoom out start to the year. So instead of beginning with the Norman Conquest, putting some new stuff in at the start. And the question I ended up asking was this one: what connected the world in AD 1000? And we start by looking at visions of the world in AD 1000. This one comes from an amazing book called the Book of Curiosities, which contains a reproduction of an 11th century Islamic map of the world, which I don't know if it's good enough to see the writing on here, but you will if you can read it, you'll know that I've turned it upside down because Islamic maps tend to be done south-north. But what you can see here is a kind of Reader's Digest version of what the world looked like, and all over it you can see these red dots, which are key trading places. We've got rivers marked, trade routes, and you can see, if you can work this out, some really key places. So you've got the coast of North Africa along here, and then we've kind of got Asia Minor as we go over this way, and we've got Europe here, which is comically, this is Europe. We've kind of got bits of Greece around here and bits of Italy over here, and it's all just kind of condensed into this kind of blob. But what you see is an Islamic world, and we think the scholar who created this was based in Cairo, but with a knowledge of things that go all the way over to China on this far eastern side, and even to the far wilds of almost Great Britain, or Britain, I should say, up here. And so we've got this really interesting view of the world that is not the traditional view of what they might think about the connections in the world. So what do we do with that? Well, again, you'll find some links to an approach with this that I wrote for a textbook chapter that was never used, and I've used now with year 7s, in which we look at different people around the world around the year 1000. What was happening? And what we do is we say, well, what are the connections? And we get students to look for trade connections, political connections. We get them to look for religious connections, how things were connected up. And we start by giving them a sense of a world that's joined up, before we then go into, let's have a look at the Norman Conquest and understand that in its context. And I think that's a really nice starting point, actually. I really love going into the world this way, because students don't really think about the world in AD 1000 in this way unless they are given some access to it. Okay, so just a range of ideas, hopefully, for ways in which principles about how we approach the teaching of history have guided me to refine and change and weed and tend and improve the history garden that I have made available to my pupils, and all for reasons that I think are really justified, because they are based in those principles about empowering students through the history education they receive, so that we can start to make some meaningful change to the way that students think about the world that they live in. And I know that lots of people are doing this anyway, but I still think it's a minority of people who really think about the principles of history education every time they do something. However, if you want some more inspiration, here are some people who are definitely doing those things. And I've mentioned this before, the curricularium sessions that Will Bailey Watson organised, it was last month now, from the point of time I'm talking here, have got some amazing things of people doing exactly this. And although they aren't directly referencing SHP principles, they are fundamentally referencing their own principles in education, in order to help them think about this kind of process of weeding and tending and improving their history gardens. So Hannah Cusworth looking at putting black back in the Union Jack, Claire Hollis on getting your curriculum to be more representative, Tom Allen about asking big questions to tie things together, and Jess Angel talked about enriching history beyond the classroom and that idea of bringing the environment. I think are amazing pieces that speak to SHP principles about why history matters and why doing history in an empowering way for students really matters. Plus, of course, there's loads and loads of other stuff that you can get on the SHP website. You can go on Ian Dawson's Thinking History website. He's got an amazing set of resources on getting across big ideas to students that fit in with a set of principles about what history is about, teaching history, and so on and so on and so on and so on. At the moment, there is a great danger that we've turned curriculum thinking into a chore or something to make ourselves feel inadequate. And actually what it should be, good curriculum thinking happens in departments, it happens in bigger communities of history teachers, it happens in communities of practice like the Schools History Project. And it should be an opportunity for us to have fun and really think about what we want to do, and really think about the principles of our history education and what we want students to come away from school knowing, and what we want them to go into later life knowing and thinking and believing about history, partly as an issue of social justice, and my goodness, look at the world around us, don't we need that right now, but also as an enriching thing for us to do as professionals as well. So do have fun with it, do take it steadily, do try and start with the little jobs that will help the bigger jobs happen. Don't try and just rip up a whole garden and put a new one in place. And don't forget, there is Gardener's Question Time, which clearly on Radio 4 is my least favourite part of the week. But in History Gardeners Question Time, when I go to Schools History Project Conference, when I go to the HA Conference, when I talk to people on Twitter and have those professional conversations, it's such an enriching thing. Have fun with it. Don't forget those people out here doing exactly the same things. I hope you have lots of fun with it, in fact, and tell us all about what you get up to. And hopefully we will see you at SHP when it's back in action in 2021 as a physical event, and we can talk about it there as well. Okay.